8 years ago, my older sister took the only thing I had ever truly believed in. Not a man, not a ring, not a future I had carefully imagined. She took my best friend. The person I had shared every secret with since childhood. The person who held my hand at my grandmother's funeral and told me grief was just love with nowhere to go. She took Marcus, and then she married him in a garden ceremony I was not invited to attend. My name is Serena. I am 32 years old. I am the daughter my parents never quite figured out what to do with the sister who was always too quiet, too serious, too consumed by ambition to be properly adored. For 8 years, I watched my family build a gleaming cathedral around my sister's life while I stood outside in the cold, pressing my face against the glass. Tonight, that cathedral is coming down. Let me start from the beginning because the beginning matters. It is the only way you will understand why I did not flinch when the moment finally arrived. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a house that smelled like lemon polish and old money. My father, Richard Calloway, was a retired federal judge with silver hair and an ego that could fill a courtroom. My mother, Caroline, had been a socialite her entire adult life, the kind of woman who treated dinner parties like military operations and maintained a mental spreadsheet of every family in the county ranked by net worth and perceived prestige. I was their second daughter, a fact they never let me forget. My sister Adrienne was 3 years older, blonde, where I was brunette, effortlessly charming, where I was methodical, instinctively social, where I preferred books and spreadsheets, and the satisfying silence of working through a complex financial model at midnight. From the time we were children, Adrienne was the headline and I was the footnote. She won the spelling bees and got the standing ovations. I won the science fairs and got a nod and a reminder to smile more. My parents loved us both, or so I believed for a long time. What they actually did was love the idea of Adrienne and tolerate the existence of me. Marcus Cole entered our lives when I was 23. He was a landscape architect from Boston, warm and quietly funny, with dark eyes and a habit of pressing wildflowers between the pages of whatever book he happened to be reading. He was not the kind of man my mother would have selected for me. He was not flashy enough, not wealthy enough, not socially strategic enough. But he saw me in a way no one in my family ever had. He listened when I talked about my work. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered the small things, the name of my difficult client, the coffee order. I always regretted the song that made me cry in the car. We dated for 2 years. We got engaged on a Tuesday morning in Central Park quietly, without a photographer or a crowd, because that was exactly who we were. I made one critical error. I trusted my sister. I brought Marcus to a family dinner at my parents' house in October of that year. I watched Adrienne laugh at every joke he made. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself she was just being Adrienne, performing for the room the way she always did. I did not see it. I was too busy being happy to notice the way her eyes followed him when he got up to refill his water glass. 4 months later, Marcus came to my apartment on a Sunday evening. He sat across from me at my kitchen table and said the words that rearranged the architecture of my entire world. He said he had feelings for Adrienne. He said they had been spending time together. He said it had started innocently, a few phone calls, a coffee in the city, a conversation about a shared interest in art that I somehow knew nothing about. He said he was confused and that he was sorry, and that he never meant to hurt me, and that these things sometimes happen between people. I sat perfectly still. I did not scream or cry or throw the coffee mug I was holding directly at his face, though I thought about it. I just watched him and waited for the part where he told me it was a joke. That part never came. He left my apartment with his keys and half the books from my shelf that he had lent me over the 2 years we spent building something together. He left and drove 40 minutes to my parents' house in Greenwich where my sister was waiting. I know this because my mother called me 3 hours later not to check on me but to explain. "Serena, she said in the voice she reserved for disappointing news about the stock market. I know this is difficult, but Adrian and Marcus have a real connection, a profound one. I think you have to consider that some relationships simply find their correct home eventually. I was sitting on my bathroom floor when she said this. I had been there for 2 hours. I told her I needed to go. She said she hoped I would be mature about it. Mature about it, I cried for 3 days. And then I got up off the floor and I never cried about Marcus Cole or Adrian Calloway again. The next 8 years were not a straight line. They were a brutal, grinding, magnificent education. I moved to New York City with $40,000 in savings and a business plan I had been quietly developing for 18 months. I had always been fascinated by distressed real estate properties that had been overlooked, undervalued, caught in legal or financial tangles that scared off conventional investors. I understood complexity in a way that most people found exhausting. I found it invigorating. My firm, Callaway Capital Restoration, started in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens with a second-hand desk and a laptop that overheated in the summer. I worked 15-hour days. I ate dinner at my desk most nights. I made mistakes that cost me money I did not have and learned from them with the grim efficiency of someone who could not afford to make the same mistake twice. By year 3, I had a small office in Midtown and 3 employees. By year 5, I had restructured 11 distressed properties across the Northeast and generated returns that made serious investors pay attention. By year 7, I was managing a portfolio worth slightly under $200 million and fielding calls from institutional funds that wanted to co-invest. I did not do this to prove anything to my family. That is what I told myself for the first 4 years. Then I became honest enough to admit the truth. Every late night, every difficult deal, every moment I chose the harder path. When the easier one was available, a small, fierce part of me was doing it for the woman sitting on that bathroom floor in October 8 years ago. Not for her pain, but to ensure she would never be that powerless again. My family knew none of this in any real detail. I sent Christmas cards. I attended my grandmother's 80th birthday. I responded to my mother's texts with cordial brevity. I had not been to the Greenwich House for a family dinner in 6 years. Then 3 weeks ago, my mother called with an invitation. She said it was an important occasion. She said the whole family would be together. She said she hoped I would make the effort to come because it would mean a great deal to everyone, including Adrian, who wanted to share some exciting news. I said I would think about it. Then I made some phone calls of my own. The restaurant was called Aurelian. It occupied the top floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan and had a 4-month waiting list for a standard reservation. My parents had secured a private dining room through a connection my father had maintained from his judicial years, a favor from a former colleague who sat on the restaurant's board of directors, the kind of quiet social currency my family had always trafficked in. I arrived 7 minutes late, which was deliberate. I wore a charcoal cashmere blazer over a simple silk blouse, dark trousers and heels that were expensive in the way that required no announcement. I wore no statement jewelry. I had learned a long time ago that the people who needed to broadcast their wealth were usually the ones who had the least of it. The maitre d' led me through the main dining room, all pale oak and warm amber lighting, and the murmur of serious conversations, and through a heavy frosted glass door into the private room where my family was already seated. They were halfway through a bottle of champagne. The private room was elegant, in the way of places that know they do not need to try too hard. A long mahogany table, crystal glasses catching the light from recessed fixtures overhead, a panoramic window running the length of one wall showing the glittering geometry of Midtown at night. My parents sat at the head of the table, my father in his charcoal suit, silver cufflinks catching the light, the posture of a man who had spent 40 years commanding rooms. My mother in a pale blue dress, pearl earrings. her hair arranged with the architectural precision she brought to everything in her life. And beside them, Adrian. She looked exactly the way she always did, which was by any objective measure beautiful. Honey blonde hair worn loose tonight, a dress in deep burgundy that she wore with the casual confidence of someone who had never once doubted her right to be the most attractive person in a room. She was 35 now, and the years had added a certain polish to her features without taking anything away. Marcus sat next to her. He was 38. He had the kind of face that aged quietly. The dark eyes were the same, the jaw a little broader. A few silver threads at his temples that suited him. He was wearing a well-cut navy blazer. He looked comfortable in the way of a man who had arrived somewhere he intended to stay. There was one other person at the table I did not recognize immediately. A man in his late 40s, seated beside my father, silver-haired, expensive in the way of old institutional money. He was introduced to me later as Gerald Marsh, a former business associate of my father's. I filed this information away. Serena! My mother's smile arrived a half-second after her eyes, which was always the tell. You made it. I said I would, I replied, taking the empty seat across from Adrienne. You look tired, Adrienne said. Her voice was warm and entirely deliberate. Are you sleeping enough? You always push yourself too hard. I'm well, thank you, I said. Serena works herself to the bone, my mother explained to Gerald Marsh, with an apologetic tilt of her head, the way one might explain a minor character flaw to a new acquaintance. She has always been very driven in her own particular direction. Gerald Marsh offered me a polite smile that communicated absolutely nothing. My father poured himself more champagne and leaned back in his chair. We were just hearing about Marcus's new commission, he said. Extraordinary project. Tell her, Marcus. Marcus straightened slightly, in the way of a man who did not need much encouragement. I've been selected to lead the landscape design for the Whitmore Cultural Campus. It's a 7-acre development in the Hudson Valley. Public and private, funding mixed-use green space scheduled to open in 3 years. It's the largest commission my firm has ever taken on. Congratulations, I said, and I meant it with exactly the amount of warmth I intended, which was none. It came together in large part because of Adrienne's connections, Marcus added, looking at my sister with the expression of a man who genuinely meant that. She introduced me to the right people at exactly the right moment. Adrienne touched his arm. He did the work. I just opened a door. That's what partners do, my mother said approvingly, looking at Adrienne the way she always looked at Adrienne, as if she were a landscape painting she had commissioned and was deeply satisfied with. The appetizers arrived. There was the usual Callaway dinner theatre, my father holding court on some political topic, my mother managing the social atmosphere with the invisible precision of an air traffic controller, Adrienne performing her role as the luminous centre of the family's gravitational field. I ate my food and listened and said little, which was also deliberate. I had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing I could do in a room full of people who underestimated me was allow them to continue underestimating me for as long as possible. Halfway through the main course, Adrienne set down her fork and looked at me with the expression she deployed when she wanted to appear generous. I've been meaning to ask you, Serena, she said. How is the business Mom mentioned you've been doing something in real estate? Something in real estate, I repeated. Yes. Commercial or residential? Primarily distressed commercial assets, some mixed use. We do some residential repositioning on the secondary market. Adrienne nodded with the polite incomprehension of someone hearing a foreign language they have no interest in learning. That sounds very niche. It is. Are you doing well with it? She asked, and the emphasis on you was so faint that most people in the room probably didn't register it. I registered everything. I'm managing, I said. My father cleared his throat. The issue with boutique operations, he announced to the table broadly, is sustainability. The moment the market shifts, the small players get squeezed out. I've seen it happen dozens of times. Real stability requires institutional backing and a proven track record. Absolutely, said Gerald Marsh, who seemed to view his primary function at this dinner as agreeing with my father. Serena has always done things her own way, my mother said with a smile that was technically complimentary. Even if it's sometimes a bit, she searched for the word. Lonely, Adrienne suggested, tilting her head with an expression of practiced sympathy. I worry about you, Serena. You've always been so isolated. You work constantly and you never seem to, land anywhere. It must be exhausting. Adrienne, Marcus said mildly. I'm not criticizing, she said immediately, raising both hands in a gesture of wounded innocence. I'm genuinely concerned. You're 32, you're clearly intelligent, but at some point, don't you want a life beyond spreadsheets? She paused and let the warmth drain from her voice just enough to make the next sentence land correctly. Or is that just not something you've been able to figure out? The table went quiet for exactly one beat. Speaking of which, my mother said, pivoting with the tactical fluency of someone who had just delivered a line and wanted to move before the audience responded, Adrienne has some news she's been waiting to share. Adrienne sat up straighter, and the performance shifted into its next register. She reached into her handbag, a structured ivory leather piece that I recognized as a limited edition seasonal release, the kind of thing that required either a wait list or a personal stylist with the right relationships, and withdrew a thick cream envelope with gold foil edging. She placed it in the center of the table. She did not hand it to me. She put it where everyone could see it. Marcus and I are hosting a dinner party next month, she announced. At the house, we're celebrating the Whitmore Commission and our 7th anniversary. It's going to be a significant gathering. The Whitmore funders will be there, a few gallery people, some of Marcus's architecture contacts. She paused. I wanted you to come, Serena. I thought it would be nice for you to meet some real players in the industry, the kind of connections you probably haven't had access to on your own. She said it the way one might offer directions to someone who looked visibly lost. The kind of connections I haven't had access to, I repeated slowly. Don't take it the wrong way, she said immediately. I just mean you've been working in your own lane for so long, maybe it would help to be in a room with people operating at a higher altitude. Gerald will be there, won't you, Gerald? Gerald. Marsh nodded, looking forward to it. It could be good for you, Adrienne continued, smoothing the napkin in her lap. Professionally and socially. It's a big, beautiful house, Serena. There's no reason to spend another evening alone in your apartment when you could be somewhere actually interesting. My mother pressed her hand over her heart with an expression of magnanimous emotion. That is so generous of you, Adrienne. It really is. My father nodded. It's a real opportunity, Serena. I hope you'll take it seriously. I looked around the table. 4 sets of eyes waited for my response. My father expecting deference, my mother expecting gratitude, Gerald Marsh expecting nothing, and Adrienne expecting the particular pleasure of watching me accept a charity invitation at her table. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. That's a very kind offer, I said. I'll have to check my calendar. Adrienne blinked. She had expected either acceptance or an embarrassed deflection. She had not expected, I'll have to check my calendar, which was the polite equivalent of, don't hold your breath. You'll have to check your calendar, she repeated. I have a fairly demanding schedule next month, I said. I'm in the middle of a significant acquisition. It requires my personal attention. More important than family, Zal? My mother asked, and her voice had that familiar, particular quality, not quite disappointed, not quite critical, landing exactly between the two, in the zone of maximum emotional pressure. Not more important, I said. just more time sensitive. What acquisition, Aggie? My father asked. He said it the way he had said it when I told him about my first deal 8 years ago, with the tone of a man expecting to be mildly underwhelmed. A commercial property portfolio in the mid-Atlantic region, I said. 12 assets. Mixed distress profile. We're in the final stages of due diligence. How much is it? He asked. I held his gaze. It's a meaningful number. He made a sound that was not quite dismissive and not quite respectful, the sound of a man recalibrating a prior assumption without wanting to fully concede the recalibration. Well, if it's as serious as you say. It is, I said. Adrienne recovered quickly, the way she always did. She reached out and patted my hand with the warm, slightly condescending affection of someone who has decided to forgive you for a minor social offense. Well, do what you have to do, but I hope you'll find a way to come. It would be good for you to be around people who are actually succeeding, Serena. I mean that with love. The table absorbed this statement without comment. My mother smiled, my father poured more wine, Gerald Marsh examined his fork. I said nothing. I checked my watch, a slim vintage Cartier that had been my grandmother's, and then I looked at the frosted glass door of the private dining room through which I could see the amber glow of the main dining room beyond. I was waiting for someone. Adrienne spent the next 40 minutes in full performance mode, which was when she was most dangerous and also, I had to admit, most impressive. She talked about the house, a colonial in Darien they had renovated 2 years ago, with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who understood that a beautiful home was its own kind of argument. She described the guest list for the dinner party in careful detail. Foundations architects, a woman who ran a contemporary art gallery in Chelsea, a couple from the Whitmore board, who apparently had a daughter Adrienne thought I might like to meet professionally. The subtext of every sentence was the same look. How high I have climbed while you were grinding away in obscurity. I let her talk. I had always let Adrienne talk. It was one of the most effective strategies I had ever developed. The act of sustained, attentive silence. While someone reveals sentence by sentence exactly what they are made of. Marcus talked about his design philosophy with genuine passion that I found even now somewhat admirable. He was a talented man. He had always been a talented man. He had simply made his choices. I had made mine. My father told a story about a judicial colleague of his who had recently published a memoir. My mother updated the table on the renovations to their kitchen and the small drama of a neighbour's controversial fence. Gerald Marsh contributed the occasional supporting detail, and then between the dessert menu being presented and the coffee being ordered, Adrienne looked at me across the table with a smile I recognized the one that preceded a calculated strike disguised as generosity, and said, "Actually, I've been thinking, Marcus and I have been considering expanding the firm, taking on a business manager, someone to handle the operational side contracts, vendor relations, scheduling, client communication, the boring stuff that Marcus doesn't have patience for." She laughed lightly. "It pays reasonably well for what it is. Around 60,000, maybe 65 if you have relevant experience. Benefits, obviously. I know you've been doing something similar in your business, managing vendors, handling numbers. It might be a nice fit. A stable salary, regular hours. You could stop scrambling." She delivered this with the smooth sincerity of someone who genuinely believed she was being kind. My father looked interested. My mother clasped her hands together. "Oh, Adrienne, that's a wonderful idea," my mother said. "Serena, that could be exactly what you need. Something with structure, something that would give you room to breathe. A guaranteed income," my father added. "At your age, stability matters more than ambition. The risk profile of what you're doing is not sustainable long term. Marcus and I would take good care of you," Adrienne said. She reached out and touched my hand again, and this time I could feel the performance in her fingertips. The warmth that was real enough to be convincing and manufactured enough to be something else entirely. You don't have to keep struggling on your own, Serena. You have family. Let us help. The table waited. I looked at my sister's hand on mine. I looked at her face, at the beautiful, confident, carefully constructed expression of generous concern. And I thought about a bathroom floor in October 8 years ago. I thought about a phone call where my mother used the word mature. I thought about 7 years of 15-hour days and a portfolio worth slightly under $200 million. I thought about the phone call I had made 3 weeks ago when I first received this invitation. And then I thought about the person who would be walking through the frosted glass door of this private dining room in approximately 4 minutes. That's very generous, I said, withdrawing my hand with smooth, unhurried composure. I'll have to decline. Adrienne's expression flickered. Just for a moment, the practiced warmth gave way to something sharper underneath. Serena, I appreciate the offer, I said, genuinely, but my schedule doesn't allow for it. Your schedule, she repeated. And now the edge was visible. You keep saying that, your schedule, your acquisition, as if you're running some major enterprise. She let out a soft laugh that was mostly air. Serena, I'm trying to do something real for you here. I'm offering you a lifeline. I don't need a lifeline, I said. With respect, she began. Adrienne. My voice did not rise. I did not shift in my chair. I looked at her the way I had learned to look at difficult counterparties across negotiating tables, steady, measured, without hostility and without retreat. I'm not going to take the job. The table went very quiet. My father set down his wine glass. Serena, don't be proud. Pride is a luxury you haven't exactly earned yet. Richard, my mother said softly, which was her way of asking him not to be too direct too quickly. No, Caroline, I'll say it, he said, leaning forward. Serena, you are 32 years old. You have been running some kind of solo operation for 8 years. You have no partners, no institutional backing, no visible security. Your sister is offering you something real, something stable, a position within a successful firm with genuine growth prospects. I would think very carefully before you let your ego get in the way of an intelligent decision. Dad, I said, how much do you think my firm is worth? He blinked. I have no idea. You've never told us anything concrete. I know, I said. I'll tell you now. And then the frosted glass door opened. She did not look like someone who needed to announce herself. That was the first thing I noticed about Elena Park when I met her 14 months ago. She occupied space without demanding attention, which was the rarest and most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of people who were very busy demanding attention. She was 41, Korean American, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of steady, unhurried presence that came from spending 2 decades at the intersection of finance and institutional power. She was the managing partner of Meridian Equity Group, a private equity firm with approximately $3 billion in assets under management. She had been profiled by 3 national financial publications in the last 2 years. She had also 14 months ago led the institutional investment syndicate that had taken a significant stake in Callaway Capital Restoration. She was also my partner in the specific legal sense of the word that appears on operating agreements and investment prospectuses. And she was more quietly one of the most important people in my life. She wore a dark green blazer and moved through the room with the calm economy of motion of someone who had spent years in rooms exactly like this one. She caught my eye across the table. A small private acknowledgement. I'm so sorry I'm late, she said, setting her leather portfolio on the table beside me with a decisive, unhurried click. The call with Tokyo ran long. They want to move on the Osaka assets ahead of schedule, which is good news but terrible timing. She looked at me now. Asha, everything all right? Perfectly fine, I said. Let me introduce you. My mother was staring. My father had stopped mid-breath. Adrienne's face had gone through 3 distinct expressions in approximately 4 seconds. Surprise, recalibration, and the beginning of something that looked like social alarm. "This is Elena Park," I said, "managing partner of Meridian Equity Group. She's my firm's primary institutional partner." Elena looked around the table with a polite professional smile and the absolute confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in any room. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway," she said, "Adrienne, Marcus." She had done her own research, apparently. "It's a pleasure." My father found his voice first. He straightened in his chair and offered his hand with the reflex of a man who recognized institutional weight when it sat down across from him. "Elena, Richard Calloway, this is quite a surprise." "A good one, I hope," she said, and took the seat I had pulled out beside me. "Meridian Equity Group," my father said, turning the name over as if he were reading it off a market report. "You're the firm that took the position in Serena's In Callaway Capital Restoration, yes," Eleanor said. She opened her portfolio and removed a slim document which she placed on the table in front of her. "We've been partners for just over a year. The performance metrics have been extraordinary. Frankly, it's been one of the strongest investments we've made in the mid-market real estate sector in the last decade." Adrienne had gone very still. My mother looked at the document and then looked at me and then looked at Elena, as if the three of us formed a puzzle she could not quite assemble correctly. "Serena never mentioned a major institutional partnership," my father said, and his voice had shifted into a register I had almost never heard from him, genuinely uncertain. "She tends not to," Elena said, and there was a warmth in her voice that was entirely real. "It's one of the things I find most impressive about her. She lets the numbers speak." She glanced at me. "Should I go ahead?" I said. Elena turned the document slightly so the table could see the header. It was a 1-page performance summary, the kind of clean, precise document that serious institutional investors prepare for serious conversations. "Callaway Capital Restoration's current portfolio," Elena said, "consists of 47 assets across 9 states. Combined appraised value as of last quarter is approximately $212 million. Net asset value accounting for debt structure, management fees, and operating costs stands at approximately $168 million. She paused and let the numbers settle into the room, of which Serena personally owns 63%. My mother made a sound. My father said nothing. He was staring at the document with the expression of a man who has just been informed in polite professional language that he has been dramatically wrong about something for a very long time. Adriana's hand, which had been resting on the table, slowly curled into a fist. 160, my mother started. "And 8 million, Elena said pleasantly, her share. The acquisition she mentioned at the start of dinner, the 12-asset Mid-Atlantic portfolio, will expand the total portfolio value by approximately 30 to 35% upon close, which we expect to happen within 60 days. Marcus looked at me. I could not entirely read his expression. There was something in it that was not quite guilt and not quite admiration, but somewhere between the two, the particular discomfort of a person who has spent years accepting a version of someone that turns out to have been badly wrong. "Serena," my father said. He cleared his throat. He tried again. "Serena, why did you never tell you?" I asked. He stopped. "You never asked?" I said, "Not really. You asked, how is the business the way you ask? How is your cold expecting a brief, unmemorable answer?" Every time I tried to explain what I was actually building, the conversation moved on within 2 sentences. I said this without anger. It was simply a fact, and I had long since processed it as such. So I stopped explaining and kept building. Adrienne stood up. I do not think she planned to stand up. It happened the way things happen with Adrienne, when the narrative has departed from her control reflexively on instinct, propelled by the need to reclaim the center of the room. She stood up and her chair scraped back loudly against the floor, and everyone looked at her, which was exactly what she needed. "This is very impressive," she said, and her voice was doing something complicated, trying to be generous while her face was doing something that was not generous at all. "I mean that. I had no idea you were doing so well. None of us did." She looked at Eleanor. "No offense, but I'm a little skeptical of one-page summaries from interested parties. It's in your firm's interest to present Serena's assets favorably." Elena set down her water glass with deliberate, quiet calm. "None taken. The figures in that document were independently audited by Deloitte. The full report is available on request. It's the same document we presented to our own limited partners last quarter." Adrienne sat back down. "The point isn't the numbers," she said, pivoting with the agility of someone who had been outmaneuvered and knew it. "The point is, Serena, you could have told us. We're your family. We would have been supportive." "Adrienne," I said, "we always supported you." "Adrienne." She stopped. I looked at my sister, really looked at her the way I had not allowed myself to look at her in years, because it required confronting too many things simultaneously. I looked at the burgundy dress and the ivory handbag and the practiced ease of her presence in a room. I looked at the man sitting beside her, who had once made me a quiet promise on a winter morning that he had then quietly broken. I looked at my parents, who were sitting very still, and I noticed that for the first time in my adult memory, they looked uncertain. I reached into my own portfolio and withdrew a single document, not a financial summary. Something else. I placed it on the table and slid it to the center. My father leaned forward and read the header. His face changed. It was a property deed. The address printed at the top was one my parents would recognize immediately. It was the address of the house in Darien, the Colonial, that Adrienne and Marcus had renovated 2 years ago and spoken about all evening with the comfortable authority of people describing something that was permanently theirs. "That came through this afternoon," I said. "The final paperwork." Adrienne stared at the document. "What is that?" "The Darien property carries a construction loan that was originated 2 years ago through a regional lender called Harwick Financial," I said. My voice was very level. Harwick Financial was one of 17 distressed lending assets that Meridian acquired from a failed New England bank. In a portfolio sale 9 months ago, I let that land, which means, like I continued, that the entity that holds the note on your home, the lender who issued your construction loan, who receives your monthly mortgage payment, who retains the right to accelerate the debt in the event of default, is now a subsidiary of Meridian Equity Group. I paused. "Of which Callaway Capital Restoration is a co-investor and managing partner." Complete silence. "In practical terms," Elena said, with the same unhurried professional calm she brought to everything, "Serena is your mortgage holder, has been for approximately 9 months. Marcus put both hands flat on the table. My mother said, "That can't be right." "It is right," I said. "I've known since the acquisition closed. I chose not to say anything then because I wasn't sure I would ever need to. I'm saying something now because I think it's relevant to the conversation we've been having tonight about who is succeeding and who needs a lifeline." Adrienne's face had gone a color I had never seen on her before. It was not anger exactly. It was something more destabilizing than anger. It was the particular pallor of someone who has discovered that the ground they have been standing on with confident casual authority is not actually solid. "You own our mortgage," she said. "My firm does, yes?" She stopped. She started again. This is some kind of power play. You've been sitting here all night letting me. Her voice cracked slightly. She pressed her lips together. You let me offer you a job. You offered me a job, I agreed. $60,000 a year to manage your vendor relations and answer your phones. The air in the room was very thin. Adrienne, my father said. His voice had lost all of its judicial authority. He sounded for the first time that I could remember in my adult life simply old. Adrienne, what is the status of the construction loan? Are you current on the payments? Adrienne did not answer immediately. Marcus answered instead. He spoke to the table without looking at anyone in particular, and his voice had the flat, compressed quality of a man choosing honesty over comfort, which I suspected did not come naturally to him in this context. We're 2 months behind, yeah? He said. The Whitmore Commission was delayed in contracting. The gap in cash flow hit us harder than we anticipated. We've been managing it. 2 months behind, my father repeated. It's being resolved, Marcus said. The Whitmore funds will clear within 30 days. We've been in communication with the lender. With my firm, I said. Marcus looked at me then. Full eye contact, which required something from him. With your firm, he said. Yes. My father turned to look at me, and I watched something happen in his face that I had been waiting for, not consciously, not as a goal I had worked toward, but that I recognized instantly when I saw it. The slow, unwilling arrival of a truth he had been managing around for 8 years. He opened his mouth, and before he could say anything, the frosted glass door opened again. The man who walked in was named Thomas Wren. He was 53 grey at the temples, wearing a suit that was conservative in the way of people who work in federal buildings and have stopped trying to impress anyone. He carried a leather briefcase and a folder stamped with a blue government seal that I recognized from 40 feet away. He was a senior investigator with the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. He was also someone I had been on the phone with for approximately 6 hours over the last 3 weeks. He looked at me, I nodded once. He looked at Gerald Marsh. Gerald Marsh looked at his hands. I apologize for the interruption, Thomas Wren said to the table. Mr. Marsh, I believe we need to have a conversation. My father turned to Gerald Marsh with an expression of complete bewilderment. Gerald, do you know this man? Gerald Marsh did not answer. He was looking at the folder in Thomas Wren's hand with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific knock on a specific door for a long time and has finally heard it. Gerald Marsh, Thomas Wren said, setting the folder on the table and opening it, is the subject of an ongoing FINRA investigation into the unauthorized use of client funds from the Callaway Family Trust, established by the late Howard Callaway in 2001. He looked at my father. Your father's trust, Mr. Callaway, the one you designated Gerald as trustee 8 years ago. My father's face went white. The investigation has identified approximately $430,000 in unauthorized withdrawals from the trust principal between 2019 and 2023. Thomas Wren continued, his voice as even and unremarkable as a man reading a grocery list. The funds were transferred to a series of personal accounts and used for purposes inconsistent with the trust's governing documents. We have complete wire transfer records. My mother gripped the edge of the table. Richard, she said, and her voice was very small. Richard, what does this mean? It means, Thomas Wren said, addressing my mother with the careful patience of someone who has had many versions of this conversation, that a significant portion of the inheritance Howard Callaway designated for his family is no longer in the trust. Mr. Marsh will have an opportunity to respond to the specific findings through the formal regulatory process. Gerald Marsh finally looked up. He looked at me, and what was in his eyes was not exactly surprise. How long have you known? He asked me. About the withdrawals, I said. 7 weeks. about the general irregularities in the trust accounting longer. My father pushed back from the table. His hands were shaking a thing I had never once seen in my life. Richard Calloway's hands did not shake. He had always been a man of absolute physical composure, someone who had spent decades on a judicial bench, cultivating stillness as a form of authority. But right now, sitting in a private dining room in Midtown Manhattan with a federal folder open on the table, his hands were shaking. "Gerald, he said. "Gerald, tell me this is a misunderstanding." Gerald Marsh said nothing. "Tell me," my father said, and his voice broke on the second word in a way that was almost unbearable to hear, "that you did not steal from my father's estate." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in a room. Thomas Wren closed his folder. He looked at Gerald Marsh with the businesslike compassion of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary function. "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to need you to come with me. Your attorney has already been notified and will meet us at the federal building." Gerald Marsh stood up slowly. He straightened his jacket. He looked at my father one more time, and whatever was in that look I did not try to interpret. Some things are between two people and the choices they made when no one else was watching. He walked out of the private dining room without speaking another word. Thomas Wren followed him. At the door, he paused and looked back at me. "The formal complaint documentation will be filed tomorrow morning," he said. "Everything else we discussed is in order." "Thank you," I said. He nodded, and the frosted glass door swung shut behind him. The room was so quiet, I could hear the ambient conversation from the main dining room. The clink of glasses, the soft percussion of a life continuing normally on the other side of a pane of glass. My father sat motionless at the head of the table. He looked like a building from which the internal structure had been suddenly removed, the exterior still standing, all the surfaces intact, but hollow inside, empty. My mother reached out and put her hand over his, and for a moment they were just two old people sitting next to each other with something irretrievable between them. Adrienne had not moved since Gerald Marsh left the room. She was staring at the space where he had been sitting, with an expression I could not entirely read. Not grief exactly, not fear, something more complex, the particular expression of a person who is beginning to understand that the story they have been telling themselves about their life has a different ending than they thought. Marcus was looking at the table. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow, measured sip. I set it down. "Dad," I said. My father looked at me. And for the first time in 8 years, possibly, for the first time in my memory, he looked at me without the filter of his expectations, without the soft distortion of his disappointment, without the comfortable, long-maintained story of which daughter was the success and which was the question mark. He just looked at me. "The trust has not been liquidated," I said. "The $430,000 in unauthorized withdrawals is documented and recoverable through the regulatory process. FINRA has authority to compel restitution. It will take time, but the principal can be largely recovered." He swallowed. "How did you know?" I commissioned an independent audit of the trust 18 months ago," I said. "After Grandpa Howard's estate attorney mentioned some irregularities in the annual accounting that hadn't been addressed. It took time to build the documented case. I didn't want to come to you with suspicions. I wanted to come to you with facts." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I considered the question. "Because I wasn't sure you would believe me over Gerald," I said. "He's been your friend for 30 years. I'm the daughter who went her own way and never quite fit the picture. If I had walked into your study 2 years ago and told you your trusted friend was stealing from your father's estate, what would you have done?" He did not answer. The answer was visible in his face, and it was not one he was proud of. "I needed the documentation to be complete," I said, "and I needed you to be in a room where you couldn't manage your way around it." My father closed his eyes. When he opened them, something was different, not fixed. I did not think this was the kind of thing that fixed quickly or completely, but different, shifted in some fundamental way that I did not yet know the full meaning of. You protected your grandfather's money, he said quietly. After everything. It was the right thing to do, I said. It had nothing to do with anything else. And that was true. It was almost entirely true. The remaining fraction, the part that was not purely altruistic, the part that understood that this moment would come and had made certain choices with that understanding, I kept to myself. Some things did not need to be said. Adrienne finally moved. She pushed her chair back from the table and stood up. And for once her movements were not graceful, they were the movements of someone who is physically uncomfortable in their own body, uncertain where to put their hands, how to stand, what to do with a face that has lost the expression it has worn for years. Serena, she said, her voice was different, quieter than I had ever heard it. I need to talk to you. All right, I said, not here. She looked at our parents, alone. I looked at Elena, who gave me a small nod and began to gather her documents with the composed discretion of a woman who understood exactly what kind of room she was in. Give us a few minutes, I told the table, and I followed my sister out of the private dining room through the frosted glass door into the amber light of the main dining room of Aurelian, where the rest of the world was still eating dinner and having ordinary conversations and living in ordinary time. We found a quiet corner near the bar, half hidden behind a low dividing screen of smoked glass and trailing greenery. The noise of the restaurant surrounded us, distant, ambient, almost kind in its indifference. Adrienne stood with her arms crossed over her chest, which I recognized as her default posture when she felt undefended. She was not crying. She was looking at the bar without seeing it, her jaw working slightly, as if she were practicing sentences she had not yet decided to say. I waited. I don't know what I expected tonight to be, she finally said. I've been planning this dinner for 3 weeks. I had a whole... She made a short, compressed sound that was not quite a laugh. I had a narrative in my head. You would come and you would be struggling and I would offer you something and you would be grateful and I would feel... She stopped. What? I asked. She looked at me. Vindicated, she said. I think I wanted to feel vindicated. For what? She looked away again. For Marcus, she said, and her voice when she said his name was very flat. Not defensive, not performative, just flat the way a fact sounds when you have lived with it long enough that it has lost its charge. I said nothing. I know what I did, she said. I have always known what I did. I spent a long time telling myself a story about why it was different from what it looked like, that you two weren't right for each other, that he came to me not the other way around, that you were so consumed with your work that you would have ended it anyway. She pressed her lips together. I stopped believing those stories a few years ago. What made you stop, Fla? I asked. She considered this. He does the same thing with me, she said. The thing he did with you, he's elsewhere sometimes, even when he's in the room. And I keep having this thought, this completely irrational thought, that maybe it was never about either of us. Maybe it's just who he is, she paused. Or maybe I'm just telling myself another story. I looked at my sister, at the burgundy dress and the smudged mascara at the corner of one eye and the particular tired quality around her mouth that I had not seen before or perhaps simply not looked for. Adrienne, I said, what do you actually want from tonight? She looked at me with something that was almost raw. I don't know, she said. I don't know if I'm asking for forgiveness or if I'm just trying to, I don't know, understand something. What? How you're not angry, she said. You sat in that room for 2 hours while I offered you a job, Serena, and you didn't even... She shook her head. How are you not angry? I was angry, I said. For a long time, it was the most productive emotion I've ever experienced. She stared at me. Anger is excellent fuel, I said. The mistake is thinking it's supposed to be a destination. It's not, it's a starting point. I looked at her steadily. I built something out of it. That's all. She stood there for a long moment. Around us, the restaurant breathed its ambient hum. The mortgage, she said finally. Our loan. What about it? Are you going to... She stopped and started again. What are you going to do with it? I looked at my sister. I looked at her for a long time, long enough to see past the performance and the competition and the careful architecture of her public self, to the person underneath who was, in the end, someone I had grown up beside someone who had made catastrophically wrong choices with consequences. She was still living with someone who was standing in a restaurant asking me a question with her defenses partially down. Your loan is current as of this month, I said. It will remain in Meridian's portfolio until it matures or is refinanced. As long as you make your payments, nothing changes. She let out a breath. That's all. That's all, I said. I'm not interested in your house, Adrian. She looked at me with an expression that was nearly undone. Why not? You could... Because destroying you wouldn't give me anything I don't already have. I said simply, and I'm done spending energy on things that don't give me anything. We stood there in the light of the restaurant, two sisters who had taken 8 years to get to a corner behind a smoked glass divider and say anything that was remotely true to each other. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was something smaller and more honest than either of those things. A first fragile conversation between two people who had been performing versions of each other for so long that the actual persons underneath were somewhat unfamiliar. There would be more conversations, harder ones, or perhaps there wouldn't be. I did not know. What I knew was that I had said what I came to say. I had done what I came to do. And the weight that I had been carrying, the dense, compressed, 8-year weight of being unseen by the people who were supposed to know me best, had become in the last 2 hours something lighter, not gone, not resolved, just lighter. I looked at my watch. I'm going to go back in, I said. You should take as much time as you need. Adrienne nodded. She uncrossed her arms, and for a moment she looked very young, not younger than her age, but young in the specific way of someone who has just set something down that they had been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. Serena, she said just as I turned to go. I waited. The job offer, she said. $60,000. A pause. I'm sorry. I looked at her. I don't mean for the money, she said. I know you don't need the money. I mean for... She searched for the word, for thinking that was what you were worth. I held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then I turned and walked back through the frosted glass door into the private dining room, where Elena was finishing a quiet conversation with my father and my mother was sitting very still with both hands folded in her lap, looking at the city through the panoramic window, like someone who has just been introduced to a view they did not know was there. I sat down. I poured myself a glass of water. The night was not finished. There was still more to come, but for the first time in 8 years, I was not the one sitting at the edge of the table, wondering if I deserved to be there. I was sitting at the center of the room, right where I belonged. When I walked back into the private dining room, the first thing I noticed was that my father had moved. He was no longer sitting at the head of the table in the posture of a man who owned the room. He was sitting in the chair to the right of the head, one seat down, as if he had made some unconscious adjustment to his own positioning without realizing he had done it. His jacket was still buttoned, his silver cufflinks still caught the light. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of his presence, the way a building looks the same from the outside after an interior wall comes down, all the surfaces intact. The foundation technically sound, but the sense of interior space irrevocably altered. Elena was seated across from him. Between them, spread across the white tablecloth, were 3 documents. 2 I recognized from her portfolio, and 1 I did not. She was speaking in a low-level voice, and my father was listening in a way I had never seen him listen to anyone who was not a federal judge or a congressional witness. Without interruption, with his full attention, my mother looked up when I entered. Her eyes went immediately to the door behind me looking for Adrienne, and then back to my face when she registered that I had returned alone. "She's taking a moment," I said. My mother nodded. There was something different about her too. The social manager I had grown up watching, the woman who could regulate the atmosphere of a dinner party with the invisible precision of a thermostat, had stepped back, and in her place was simply Caroline Calloway, 63 years old, sitting very quietly, with her hands in her lap, in a room where she had lost the ability to manage anything. I sat down. I poured a glass of water. I looked at the document Elena had placed on the table, the one I had not seen before. "What is that?" I asked. Elena glanced at me. "The preliminary restitution schedule from FINRA's preliminary findings. Thomas sent it over while you were out." She turned the document toward me. "The short version is that Gerald's exposure is cleaner than we feared. The transfers were poorly concealed. He used his own routing information for 2 of the 5 wire transactions. A first-year forensic accountant could have found it." "Why didn't the trust's auditor find it?" my father asked. His voice was quiet and entirely without authority. "Because the trust used Gerald's firm for auditing," Eleanor said. She said it without judgment, which I suspected was the most cutting way to say it. "He reviewed his own work. It's not uncommon in private trust arrangements that prioritize personal relationships over structural separation." My father pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. "I appointed him trustee because he had been my father's attorney for 20 years. My father trusted him completely." "Most fiduciaries are appointed for exactly that reason," Elena said. "Trust is the mechanism. It's also the vulnerability." And I watched my father receive this information, the specific, impersonal professionalism of it. And I watched it do something that 30 years of judicial career had apparently not managed to do. It made him look uncertain, not about the facts which were by now clear enough, uncertain about himself, about the particular confidence with which he had managed the world, the long-maintained belief that his judgment about people and situations was a reliable instrument. $430,000, he said mostly to himself. 432,840, Elena said. "The full amount is documented. FINRA's preliminary assessment is that restitution is achievable within 24 months given Gerald's personal asset profile. He owns property in Westchester and a retirement account of sufficient size." My father looked at me. "You've been building this case for 18 months. "The audit took 6 months, I said. "The documentation process took another 12. FINRA's formal investigation began 4 months ago once the evidence package was complete." "Why didn't you come to me?" he asked. And there was something in the question that was not quite accusatory, something rawer than that, when you first suspected. "Why didn't you?" "Because the last time I came to you with something I believed was true. I said you told me I was being proud and difficult, and that I should accept the situation like an adult." He looked at the table. "That was 8 years ago," I said. "I know, but patterns establish themselves for reasons." The silence that settled after that was not comfortable. It was the silence of a specific truth sitting in the room with everyone being looked at directly for the first time. My mother lifted her head. "Serena," her voice was careful, not the social manager's voice, not the disappointed parent's voice, something older and less defended. "I want to say something to you." I waited. She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked at me. "I have handled many things in this family poorly," she said. "The way I responded when you told us about Marcus, the way I have spoken about your work. Tonight, what Adrienne said about the job and what I said before, that I did not intervene when I should have, and the things I did say were unkind. Yes, I said. I did not soften it. Softening it would have done her no favours. She received this with a small, steady nod. I am not going to tell you that I understood what you were building, she said. I didn't. I had formed an idea of what your life looked like, and I never seriously questioned it because questioning it would have required admitting I wasn't paying sufficient attention. She paused. That is a form of laziness I am not proud of. It is, I agreed. I would like the opportunity, she said, to pay better attention, if you are willing to allow it. The room was very quiet. This was not the apology in the original script I had rehearsed in my head on the drive up from the city. In the version I had imagined, my mother apologized dramatically at length, with full recognition of every specific failure. This was smaller than that, less complete, more honest. I looked at Caroline Calloway at the pearl earrings and the blue dress and the social armour that had, over the course of one dinner, been largely stripped away to reveal a woman who was underneath all of it, genuinely trying to locate something real. I'm not ready to have that conversation tonight, I said, but I'm not closing it. She nodded. That was enough for now. Adrienne returned to the table 7 minutes later. She had done something to her face in the interim, not repaired the makeup precisely, but washed it away, which produced an effect that was more disarming than the original. She looked clean and tired and younger than she had all evening. She sat down in her chair and folded her hands on the table and did not reach for her wineglass. She looked at Marcus. He looked back at her. Some kind of communication passed between them that I was not privy to and did not try to interpret. They had 7 years of shared language. Whatever it contained was theirs to negotiate. I owe everyone at this table an honest accounting, Adrienne said. She said it to the room, not to any individual. The dinner party, the announcement about the Whitmore Commission, the way I introduced all of it. She paused. I was performing. I do that. I've done it my entire life because it's the only way I knew how to secure my position in a room. Tonight I was doing it in a room full of people who see through performance, and the result was... She gestured at the scattered documents and the empty chair where Gerald Marsh had been sitting. This. My father looked at her. Adrienne. I'm not done, she said quietly, and something in her voice made him stop. I also want to say something specifically to Serena. I waited. 8 years ago, I did something I have never once directly apologized to you for, she said. I told myself it was complicated. I told myself that relationships are messy and hearts are unruly. And Marcus came to me and I was honest when I could have hidden it. And that had to count for something. She shook her head slightly. None of that is an apology. It's an explanation. And you never needed my explanation. You needed my apology. The room held still. I am sorry, Adrienne said, for taking Marcus, for the way it was done, for the fact that I have spent 8 years being the person who won, when you were the person who was hurt, and I have leaned into that narrative in ways I am not proud of. She held my gaze. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I know better than to ask for that. I'm just saying it. Because it needed to be said 8 years ago, and wasn't. I looked at my sister. The anger was there, the old deep 8-year anger. But it was no longer the burning thing it had once been. It had done its work. It had built an empire. Now it was just a fact sitting in the room with us being acknowledged for the first time. Thank you, I said, simply, without ornamentation. She nodded. She reached for her water glass. She took a drink. And then, because nothing about family is ever simple, and the evening was not finished, Marcus cleared his throat. There's something else, Marcus said. Everyone looked at him. He was sitting with his hands flat on the table in the deliberate posture of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining option and has committed to it entirely. He looked at me. The Whitmore Commission, sir, he said. the funding situation. It's more complicated than I said. Adrian went very still. The contracting delay is real, he said, but it's not the whole picture. We're behind on the construction loan because the commission represents approximately 60% of the firm's projected revenue for the next 18 months. If the Whitmore contract... He stopped. He restarted. There is a clause in the Whitmore agreement that allows the foundation board to terminate the contract if the lead designer firm experiences significant financial instability during the pre-construction phase. How significant? Elena asked. Marcus looked at her. Material default on financial obligations. So such as a mortgage? Yes. Eleanor was already opening her portfolio. What's the timeline on the next payment? 14 days, Marcus said. Elena looked at me. This was the moment. I had known it was coming. I had been turning it over in my mind for weeks. Since the acquisition closed and the Harwick portfolio landed in Meridian's hands, and I understood with the particular clarity of someone who has spent years untangling financial structures exactly what I held and exactly what could be done with it. I could accelerate the loan. In the event of 2 consecutive missed payments, the note permitted acceleration immediate demand for the full outstanding balance. Marcus and Adrienne could not produce the full outstanding balance. The Whitmore contract clause would trigger. The commission would dissolve. The firm would face a cascading series of failures from which recovery would be at minimum extremely difficult. I had the power to do it. I had had the power to do it for 9 months. I had thought about it exactly once for about 45 minutes, on the night the acquisition closed, and I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine and allowed myself to fully imagine the mechanics of it, the sequence, the outcome. And then I had made a different decision, not because of sentiment exactly, not because of family exactly, but because of something Elena had told me early in our partnership in a meeting room in Midtown, when I was still learning to think at institutional scale. The most expensive thing a person can do in this business, she had said, is make decisions out of anger. Anger is useful for starting things. It is disastrous for finishing them. I had written that down. I had looked at it many times since. Elena, I said, what's the restructuring provision in the Harwick note? Elena found the page without searching for it. She had read the full document many times. The lender may, at its discretion, offer a payment deferral of up to 90 days in cases of documented temporary cash flow interruption, provided the borrower submits a written remediation plan and the lender determines the plan to be credible. Is the Whitmore funding credible? I asked. The Whitmore Foundation has $3.2 billion in endowment assets and a 40-year track record of completing funded projects, Elena said. The funding is credible. I looked at Marcus. Submit the remediation plan to Elena's office by Friday. Include the Whitmore contract documentation and the projected cash flow timeline for the next 6 months. We'll review it and make a determination on the deferral within 72 hours. Marcus stared at me. That's not... He stopped. He tried again. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, I said. I'm doing it because it's the correct financial decision. A performing loan is worth more than a foreclosure. That's all. He held my gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, complex and layered and not entirely comfortable, and then he nodded. Adriana had been watching this exchange with the expression of someone witnessing something they did not entirely understand, but recognized as significant. She looked at me, and for a moment the old dynamic, the competition, the performance, the decades of managed distance was entirely absent. Why? She said quietly. Because I said so, I said, and because your house is not my battlefield. She looked down at the table. My father had been quiet during the exchange about the mortgage. He was a man who understood the mechanics of legal and financial leverage 30 years on the bench, had ensured that, and he had followed the conversation with the focused attention of someone doing rapid calculations. When Marcus and Adrienne had excused themselves to make a phone call to their attorney, I presumed, or to one of the Whitmore contacts, and my mother had stepped out with them, my father and I were left alone in the private dining room for the first time. Eleanor had excused herself with the tact of someone who understood exactly when to leave a room. The restaurant hummed quietly beyond the frosted glass. My father looked at the city through the panoramic window. The lights of Midtown moved and glittered with the specific indifference of a city that does not care what happens in any given private dining room on any given Tuesday evening. "Tell me about the firm," he said, "like the real version." I looked at him. "What do you want to know?" "Everything you didn't tell me over 8 years because you expected me not to listen." I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him. I told him about the first deal, a derelict warehouse in Bridgeport that I bought for $400,000. With money I had borrowed at unfavorable terms from a regional lender because no institutional partner would look at a 24-year-old woman with no track record and a business plan printed on a second-hand printer. I told him about the 6 months I spent working with a contractor who tried to overcharge me by 40%, and the 3 months of legal wrangling that followed when I refused to pay it. I told him about the sale that closed 18 months later at $710,000, and the specific physical full-body feeling of depositing the proceeds and understanding for the first time that the plan was real. I told him about year 2 when I lost a deal because a more experienced investor outmaneuvered me on the due diligence timeline, and I spent a week recalibrating my entire approach to acquisition analysis. I told him about year 4 when I turned down a partnership offer from a mid-sized private equity firm because the terms would have given me capital but surrendered 40% of my equity and my decision-making authority, and how my decision had been widely considered in my network to be either very stupid or very confident, and how it turned out to be both and how it had worked out. I told him about meeting Eleanor, about the specific conversation in the Meridian conference room when she asked me to walk her through my thesis on distressed mid-market real estate, and I had talked for 40 minutes without a note in front of me, and she had stopped me at the end and said, "I've been looking for an operator like you for 3 years. Let's talk terms." My father listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the calibrations and corrections and gentle redirections that had characterized every conversation we had ever had about my professional life. He simply listened, which was, I realized, what I had wanted from him for approximately 2 decades and had never quite stopped wanting, even when I had convinced myself I didn't. When I finished, he was quiet for a while. "I owe you an accounting too," he said finally. I waited. "I have not been a fair witness to your life," he said. "I formed a conclusion about your trajectory. Early, perhaps, when you left Greenwich, perhaps earlier, and I maintained that conclusion with far more conviction than the evidence warranted." He paused. "A judge is supposed to evaluate evidence as it arrives, to update his assessment as the record develops. I failed to do that with you, entirely." "You did," I said. "I favored Adrienne," he said, "structurally and consistently. I told myself it was because she needed more support, that she was more fragile, that your competence made you more self-sufficient, and therefore less in need of my attention." All of that was true to some degree, but it was also a rationalization for laziness, and for the comfortable satisfaction of watching one of my children perform in ways I found legible. He looked at me steadily. "You were never illegible, Serena. I just didn't try hard enough to read you." I absorbed this, not with the desperate relief of a long-denied validation the way the version of me that cried on a bathroom floor 8 years ago might have, but with something quieter and more durable, the simple recognition of a truth being spoken plainly by someone who had resisted speaking it for a long time. "Thank you," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," I said. "I believe you." He looked at the window again. "The trust," he said. "When the restitution is complete, that money belongs to you and Adrian equally. Whatever I can do to ensure that the process moves efficiently, I will do. Elena's office has a contact at FINRA who will keep you informed," I said. "The timeline is approximately 24 months, but could be shorter if Gerald's attorneys counsel cooperation, which I think they will." He nodded. "And Gerald? What about him, Did you?" He stopped, framed it differently. "Did you have any warning, any indication before the audit that something was wrong?" "I thought about this. A feeling, I said. When I was home for Grandma's birthday 2 years ago, I asked Gerald a routine question about the trust's investment allocation, and he answered it just slightly too smoothly. The way people answer questions they've rehearsed." I paused. "I've been in enough due diligence rooms to know what prepared answers sound like, so I commissioned the audit." "A feeling, Asta," my father said, and in his voice was something that sounded like the specific pain of a man who had spent a career trusting his own feelings about people and had been in this case catastrophically wrong, while the daughter he had underestimated was right. "Feelings are data points," I said, "not conclusions. You need the documentation too." He nodded slowly. "Your firm, do you need anything from me, professionally or otherwise?" I almost smiled. "No," I said. "But thank you for offering." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Of course you don't." "I might," I said, "need you to have dinner with me sometime, without an agenda, without Adrian's news and Gerald's investment performance and whatever else this evening was supposed to be. Just," I paused, "just dinner." He looked at me. His eyes were bright in a way I had not seen before. "I would like that very much," he said. The rest of the evening assembled itself in pieces. Adrienne and Marcus returned from their phone call with the subdued, recalibrated energy of people who have received unexpected news and are still processing it. They sat down. Adrienne ordered tea. Marcus looked at the financial documents on the table with the expression of a man confronting his own financial ignorance and finding it both humiliating and motivating, which was, I thought, at least the right starting point. Elena came back having conducted what sounded like 2 separate phone calls in the corridor and resumed her seat with the efficient warmth of someone who has managed complex rooms all her professional life. My mother returned last. She sat down beside my father. She reached out without looking at him and placed her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. The waiter appeared at the door cautiously, with the expression of someone who has been monitoring a private room all evening and is not entirely certain what he is returning to. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked. "Can I bring anything sour coffee, please?" I said. "For the table." He retreated with visible relief. The coffee came. We drank it. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. It was the careful, exploratory kind of conversation that happens between people who have been given a new map of each other and are still learning how to navigate it. My father asked Eleanor about Meridian's thesis on secondary market assets. My mother asked me about my apartment in the city, not with the polite skepticism she had always brought to questions about my life in New York, but with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Adrienne talked about the Whitmore project in the honest, unperformed way. She had talked about very little, all evening, the actual design, the challenges of the site, what Marcus was trying to accomplish. Marcus talked about the construction timeline and the site constraints, and the particular challenge of integrating the public access component with the private gallery spaces. He talked about it with his hands moving and his voice engaged, and I remembered with a clarity that was more informational than painful that this was why I had fallen in love with him, not the warmth or the wildflowers, though those were real. The passion. The way he became fully himself when he talked about what he made. I had spent 8 years being angry at him. At this precise moment, listening to him talk about his work, I felt nothing. Not love, not resentment, not the complicated mix of the two that had occupied so much interior space for so long. Just the simple recognition of a person who had once mattered to me, who had made choices I couldn't forgive quickly, and now didn't need to forgive on any particular schedule, who was sitting across a dinner table, being exactly who he was. It was, I thought, a form of completion, not the completion of a story, the completion of a particular chapter. We left the restaurant at 10:15. The elevator from the private dining floor to the lobby was silent, except for the soft, mechanical hum of descent. My parents stood to one side, Adrienne and Marcus to the other, Elena beside me, her portfolio tucked under her arm, her expression composed and comfortable in the way of someone who has spent a long evening doing exactly what she came to do. In the lobby, all pale marble and the quiet authority of a place that has been excellent for a long time, and knows it, we assembled for the specific, awkward theatre of departure. My father shook Elena's hand with genuine formality and said, "It was a pleasure to meet you. I hope we'll have the opportunity to speak again." Eleanor said she hoped so too. She sounded like she meant it. My mother hugged me, not the gestural air-adjacent hug of the family dinner circuit. A real hug, both arms a fraction of a second longer than comfortable, which was where the real feeling tends to live. I put my arm around her and let it be real for a moment. "Drive carefully," I said. "We always do," she said, and then laughed slightly at herself for saying something so insufficient, which was more honest than most things she had said all evening. My father placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who has a great deal more to say than he has language for right now. "We'll call," he said. "I'll answer," I said. He nodded. He steered my mother toward the door. Marcus stopped in front of me. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his jacket pockets, and whatever he was trying to assemble into words took long enough that Adrienne, who was beside him, reached out and touched his arm lightly, not to stop him, but to steady him. "For what it's worth, King," he said, "I've thought about October a lot. That Sunday evening." A pause. "What I said to you. How I said it." "Marcus," I said. "I know," he said. "I know it doesn't. I know you've thought about it," I said. "I can see that you have. That's enough for tonight." He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and stepped back. Adrienne looked at me. The burgundy dress, the washed face, the particular expression of a woman who has spent an evening being stripped of every performance and is discovering, with some combination of terror and relief, that what remains underneath is a person she has not spent nearly enough time with. "Can I call you?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "You can call me," she nodded. She pressed her lips together. She turned and walked with Marcus through the lobby doors into the city night, and I watched them go, and I felt not warmth, not cold, not the old complicated burn. Something that was the absence of pain. Something that was, if I was being precise, a great deal like freedom. Elena and I stood on the sidewalk outside Aurelian while her car pulled around from the parking structure. The night was cool and sharp, the city doing its permanent business around us. Traffic and voices and the particular ambient music of 10 million people living their lives in overlapping proximity. I breathed it in, the cool air, the city smell, the evening that was almost over. "Well," Elena said. "Well, I agreed." "That was one of the more eventful client dinners I've attended," she said. "It wasn't technically a client dinner." "No," she said, "but it was the most important one." I looked at her. Elena Park was not a sentimental person. She was precise and efficient, and measured in the way of someone who has learned that sentiment is expensive in professional contexts. But she was also, I had discovered over 14 months of partnership, someone who paid attention to what mattered, who noticed things, who showed up. "Thank you for coming," I said. I know it was a significant ask. You never ask for things you don't need, she said. That's one of the things I trust about you. She paused. Are you all right? I thought about it. Actually thought about it, which was something I had not done for most of the evening. There had been too much to execute, too much to manage, too much forward momentum to pause for the kind of honest internal accounting the question deserved. Was I all right? I had arrived at this dinner with a plan built over 18 months. I had executed most of it. Gerald Marsh was in federal hands. The trust assets were on their way to recovery. My family had seen for the first time in 8 years what I had actually built. My father had apologized. My mother had reached for something real. Adrienne had said the words she should have said 8 years ago. And Marcus had stood in a marble lobby and tried to tell me he was sorry, and I had let him. Was I all right? I think I will be, I said. That feels more honest than yes. Elena considered this. Reasonable, she said. Her car arrived, a dark town car that pulled to the curb with the quiet precision of good logistics. The driver came around to open the door. The Mid-Atlantic acquisition closes in 51 days, Elena said. We should walk the Newark property before then. The environmental report came back with a flag on the northwest corner that I want your read on. Thursday afternoon, I said. I'll have David send you the calendar. Thursday afternoon, she agreed. She looked at me one more time with the expression that I had come to understand meant I noticed something, but I'm not going to make it a whole thing. Go home, Serena. Get some sleep. Yes, I said. She got in the car. It pulled away. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the cool October air, watching the taillights merge into traffic. Around me, the city continued its beautiful, indifferent business. A couple walked past, laughing at something on a phone. A doorman from a building down the street whistled for a taxi. Somewhere above me, behind one of the 10,000 lit windows, someone was having a dinner that would change things for them. Or not. You could rarely tell from the outside. I thought about the 24-year-old on the bathroom floor. I thought about her with the specific, complicated tenderness I had developed for her over the years, not pity, not grief, but something closer to the feeling you have for a version of yourself who did not yet know what was coming, who was sitting on cold tiles in October believing the worst thing had happened, when in fact the worst thing had simply cleared the ground for everything that came after. I wanted to tell her something. I did not know exactly what. That it gets better was too simple and not quite true. It doesn't get better, it gets different. And different contains multitudes, some of them excellent, and some of them hard, and some of them both at once. That you'll be fine was too tidy, that they'll regret it someday well. Tonight had been a version of that. But watching people regret things turned out to be far less satisfying than building something that made their regret irrelevant. What I wanted to tell her, if I could have found the right words, was this: you're going to build something. It will be hard and it will take longer than feels fair, and there will be nights when you are not sure it's working and you'll keep going anyway. And one day you'll be standing on a sidewalk in October and you'll realize that the thing you were afraid had ended you was actually the first sentence of the story. I did not have any of those words 8 years ago. I had been learning them ever since. I pulled out my phone. I called my driver. I waited on the curb with my hands in my coat pockets, and my face lifted slightly toward the cold night sky, feeling the particular peace of someone who has finished something difficult and is not yet thinking about what comes next. 3 weeks after the dinner at Aurelian, Gerald Marsh entered into a cooperation agreement with FINRA's Enforcement Division. His attorney, as I had predicted, counselled cooperation, which was the only sensible advice available given the completeness of the documented evidence. The formal restitution agreement was filed in Federal District Court on a Thursday morning and covered the full $432,000 to be repaid from Gerald's personal assets, in quarterly installments over 20 months. My father attended the filing in person. He sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man conducting a private audit of his own judgment. When it was over, he called me from a bench in the courthouse lobby and said, "It's done." I said, "I know, Elena's office notified me this morning." There was a pause and then he said, "I wanted you to hear it from me directly." I said I was glad he called. We had dinner 2 weeks later, just the two of us at a small Italian place in the West Village that he had never been to and that I had been going to for 5 years. We ate pasta and talked about his father, my grandfather Howard, who had been a civil engineer and a difficult, brilliant, demanding man, who had left his family a trust fund as an apology for all the years he had been too focused on work to be present, which was its own kind of complexity. We talked about what it was like to sit on the federal bench for 30 years. We talked about my firm. It was not a healed relationship, it was the beginning of one, which is different and more real and harder to sustain and worth more in the end. My mother called me the following Sunday. We talked for 40 minutes. She asked about the Newark acquisition and I explained the basics, and she listened and asked follow-up questions that were unexpectedly intelligent, because Caroline Calloway had spent 63 years being extremely observant about the world, and simply directing that intelligence towards social architecture rather than financial analysis. She said she had been thinking about what I had told her at dinner about patterns and attention, and that she had made an appointment with a therapist, which was not something she had ever done before, and which she described with the wry discomfort of someone doing a thing they believe is correct, but find personally humiliating. I told her I thought it was a good idea. She said she thought so too in an annoyed voice that made me smile. Marcus submitted the remediation plan to Elena's office on Friday, as I had requested. It was thorough, which surprised me. He had not cut corners or relied on optimistic projections. The plan was conservatively modelled, clearly documented and accompanied by a signed letter from the Whitmore Foundation confirming the funding timeline. Elena's team reviewed it over the weekend, and on Monday morning she called me. "The plan is credible," she said. "I'm recommending the 90-day deferral." "Then approve it," I said. "Already done," she said. "His attorney will have the documentation this afternoon." The Whitmore Commission proceeded on schedule. Marcus's firm broke ground the following spring on a 7-acre site in the Hudson Valley that would 3 years later become a campus widely cited in architectural publications as a significant contribution to the integration of public and private cultural space. I read one of those articles on a Tuesday morning over coffee and noted with something that was entirely neutral that Marcus was quoted extensively, and that the photograph showed him standing on the finished site with the expression of a man who had done exactly what he set out to do. I was glad for him. I was surprised to find that I meant it. Adrienne called on the 3rd Tuesday of November, which was 3 weeks after the dinner. I was at my desk when the call came in the middle of reviewing the final due diligence package for the Mid-Atlantic acquisition, which had grown in complexity during the final weeks, in the way that large deals tend to accumulating small, urgent problems that required attention and precision and the particular patience of someone who knows the destination is worth the journey. I picked up. "Is this a bad time?" she asked. "I have 20 minutes, I said. "That's usually enough for the real conversation." She laughed, an actual laugh, not the performed version. It sounded different, more like the laugh I remembered from childhood before the competition had calcified into something else. "I don't know how to start," she said. "That's usually where people start," I said, "by saying they don't know how to start." She was quiet for a moment. Then I told Marcus about the bathroom floor. I waited. I told him what I knew about that night, what Mom said to you, the fact that you handled it the way you did, and I never... She stopped. "I never once in 8 years acknowledged it. Not to you, not to him, not even to myself, really. I just moved forward, the way you're supposed to. Except the thing about moving forward without acknowledging something is that you carry it the whole time. You just don't call it what it is. What do you call it now? I asked. Damage, she said. That I did, that I'm responsible for. A pause. Marcus said something after I told him. He said, the thing about Serena is that she never needed anyone to tell her she was worth something. She already knew. Another pause. I've been thinking about that for 3 weeks. What have you been thinking? That I'm not sure it's true, she said. I think you knew it theoretically. But I think part of why you worked as hard as you did for as long as you did was to make it impossible for anyone to argue otherwise, and that's not the same thing. I was quiet. I'm not saying you're broken, she said quickly. You're clearly not broken. I'm saying I know what you're saying. I said she was right, not completely. The picture was more complex than she had drawn it, and I had done a great deal of work in 8 years to separate my worth from my work, with varying success at varying times. But she was not wrong. There was a version of the ambition that was always partly a fortress. Something built to be both achievement and argument. Look at this. Now tell me I'm not enough. I've been in therapy for 4 years, I said. It's an ongoing project. Oh, she said. She sounded slightly undone by this admission. I didn't know. You wouldn't, I said. I don't broadcast it. Is it? She stopped. Is it helping? Yes, I said. It's one of the best decisions I've made. A long pause, then Mom started seeing someone. She told you. She told me. I was glad. She's finding it humiliating, Adrian said. And there was genuine affection in her voice, the specific affection of someone who knows a person well enough to find their particular form of dignity both maddening and endearing. She called me after the first session and described the whole thing like she was debriefing from a difficult negotiation. That tracks, I said. We both laughed. And in the laughing, in the specific easy rhythm of it, the shorthand of shared parentage and shared memory, and the particular comedy of knowing the same people well enough to predict exactly how they will experience therapy, I felt something shift. A small movement, the first loosening of something that had been very tightly held for a very long time. Not sisterhood exactly. Not yet. That would take more time and more Tuesday phone calls and more 20-minute conversations that turned into 40-minute ones. But the direction of it, the possibility. I have to get back to the acquisition, I said. But Adrian, yeah, thank you for calling. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you for answering, she said. The Mid-Atlantic acquisition closed on a Wednesday morning in late November, 53 days after the dinner at Aurelian. Elena and I signed the closing documents in a conference room in Washington, D.C., with 2 attorneys from each firm, and a closing agent who had done so many transactions of this scale that he moved through the paperwork with the practiced efficiency of someone doing something he has done 10,000 times before. When the final document was signed and countersigned, and the closing agent confirmed the wire transfer had cleared, Eleanor leaned back in her chair and looked at me with the expression I had come to understand meant I am satisfied, but I will not make a production of it. 47 assets becomes 59, she said. Combined portfolio value passes 250, I said. Yes. I looked at the documents stacked neatly in front of the closing agent. 59 properties, $250 million in combined value, approximately. 8 years of 15-hour days and difficult deals and the grinding, exhilarating work of building something from almost nothing into something real. My grandfather Howard had been a civil engineer. He had spent his life building infrastructure, bridges and roads, and the invisible systems that hold cities together. He had been absent and difficult and brilliant, and had left his family a trust fund as an apology. He had built things, and I had, without planning it, done the same. I thought about this, about the long arc of it, about a 24-year-old on a bathroom floor and a judge's daughter in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens with a second-hand desk and a business plan and a ferocious necessary anger that had driven her forward until the day she could replace it with something better. "Are you all right?" Elena asked, because she always asked, and because the answer was always more interesting than the question implied. "Yes," I said, and this time I meant it completely. She nodded. "Then let's get lunch." I went back to Greenwich once in December. Not to the house my parents had sold it the previous spring, a decision they had made together with the quiet practicality of two people recalibrating what they needed versus what they had always assumed they were supposed to have. They had moved to a smaller place in New Haven near the university, where my father occasionally lectured. My mother had joined a garden club and taken up watercolour painting, which she described on the phone with the same wry self-deprecation she had applied to therapy, and which she was apparently, according to my father, genuinely good at. I went back because my grandmother, my mother's mother, Nana Ruth, who was 84 and spectacularly indifferent to everything that was not her garden or her grandchildren, had asked me to come for her birthday, not through my mother or as part of a family announcement. She had called me herself on my direct line and said, "Serena, I'm having 12 people over on the 14th. I would like you to be one of them, and bring whatever wine you think is appropriate because your mother will choose something dull." I had laughed for what felt like the first time in a week. Nana Ruth had always been the one who saw me, not with the performed understanding that other adults in my childhood had sometimes offered the teachers who said, "She's just different, she'll find her place," but with the direct, unsentimental attention of someone who had been paying close attention to people for 84 years and trusted what she saw. When I was 15, she had sat across from me at her kitchen table and watched me work through a calculus problem for an hour, not helping, not interrupting, just watching, and then said, "You know what you are? You're a builder. Everything you touch, you're already thinking about what it could be." She had said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a statement of geological fact. I had thought about that sentence in a great many conference rooms and closing ceremonies since. I drove up on the 14th with a bottle of wine that I had consulted a sommelier about, and a small wrapped package for Nana Ruth, a photograph I had commissioned of her garden in summer taken from the specific angle she had always said she liked best, printed large and framed in the simple white frame she favoured. She unwrapped it at the table with 12 people watching and looked at it for a long time with her head tilted slightly to the left, which was what she did when she was being genuinely moved and trying not to show it. "You remembered the angle," she said. "You mentioned it 4 years ago." "I mention things once," she said. "Most people forget them immediately." She looked at me over the frame. "You never forget things." "Not the important ones," I said. She held my gaze for a moment with the clear, dark eyes that had missed very little in 84 years. "Are you happy?" she asked, not the casual social question, the real one. I thought about it, which was what she expected. "I'm building toward it," I said. "That feels honest." She nodded. "Good answer," she said. "That's the right answer. People who say they're simply happy usually aren't paying attention." She turned the photograph over in her hands. "Your grandfather would have liked to meet you. The adult version." My great-grandfather, she meant, Howard the civil engineer, the difficult, brilliant man who built bridges. "I think I know him a little," I said, "through the trust, through the shape of what he left. He built things because building was the only way he knew how to love," she said. "The mistake he made was not telling anyone, not explaining that the bridge was a love letter." She looked at me. "Don't make that mistake." I looked at her. "Tell people," she said simply. "The ones worth telling. Tell them what you're building and why. Don't make them wait 8 years to find out." I thought about my father in the Italian restaurant. in the West Village, leaning forward over his pasta, listening for the first time to the real version of what I had been doing with my life. I thought about my mother on the phone asking follow-up questions about the Newark acquisition with her unexpected redirected intelligence. I thought about Adrian, 3 weeks and several Tuesday calls, into the slow, careful, exploratory work of knowing each other differently. "I'm trying," I said. "Good," Nana Ruth said. She set the photograph down carefully on the table. "Now, tell me about this business of yours, the real version, all of it. I have time." So I told her. I told her everything the way I had told my father, but with more warmth and fewer numbers and more of the texture of the thing, the feeling of the first deal, closing the particular satisfaction of an asset that looked like a liability, and turned out to be both the experience of walking into a conference room full of men who expected to be waiting for someone else and watching their expressions adjust when they realized I was the one running the meeting, the grinding work, and the rare, perfect moments when something complicated resolved into clarity. Elena, the portfolio, the 59 properties. She listened. She asked questions. She drank her wine. She approved of my choice, which she communicated with a small, decisive nod that meant more than most people's standing ovations. And she asked me questions that were unexpectedly specific and revealed once again that she had been paying close attention to everything for 84 years and had simply been waiting for the right conversation. We talked for 2 hours at that table, while the other 10 guests moved around us and cleared plates and refilled glasses, and eventually drifted into other rooms, leaving the two of us there in the warmth of her kitchen, with the winter garden dark beyond the window. When I finally stood up to go, she reached out and took my hand in both of hers. Her hands were small and very strong, the hands of someone who had spent decades in soil, and she held it for a moment. "You know what you are," she said. The same opening she had used when I was 15. "A builder," I said. "Yes," she said. "And you're building the right things now." She let go of my hand. "Both kinds." I looked at her. "The properties," she said, "and the rest of it." She waved one hand in the general direction of the world. "The people, the patience, the learning how to let people see you." A pause. "That one's harder than any acquisition. You know that." "I'm learning hard," I said. "Good," she said. "Keep going." It is February now, 4 months since the dinner at Aurelian. My office is on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown, where I can see on clear days the geometric perfection of the grid stretching south toward the harbor. I drink my coffee at the window most mornings for exactly 5 minutes before the day assembles itself into the series of problems and decisions and negotiations that constitute the work. It is good work, it is hard and complicated and sometimes frustrating and consistently interesting, and it is entirely mine. The Mid-Atlantic portfolio is integrated. The Newark Properties environmental flag was resolved a containment issue from a previous industrial tenant that was manageable and already priced into the acquisition. 3 of the 12 new assets are already generating above projected returns. The other 9 are performing to plan. Elena and I have begun preliminary discussions about the next phase of expansion, which is larger and more structurally complex than anything I have attempted before, and which requires me to operate at a scale that is still slightly outside my comfort zone. I find this energizing rather than frightening, which is either growth or hubris, and the only way to find out which is to go forward and see. I have dinner with my father every 3 weeks, sometimes in the city, sometimes in New Haven. We have covered over the course of these dinners approximately 40 years of accumulated conversational debt. We are making progress. He has begun to refer to Callaway Capital Restoration by name rather than by the vague honorifics he previously used: your business, your operation, your thing. This seems small. It is not small. My mother calls on Sundays. She has been in therapy for 4 months and describes it with decreasing amounts of irony and increasing amounts of genuine interest in what she is learning, which is its own form of progress. She has taken to sending me photographs of her watercolours, which she presents without comment as data. They are quite good. I told her so and she said, "Well, I have an eye for things. I've always had an eye for things." I agreed and did not say the rest of what I was thinking, which was that the eye had sometimes been pointed in the wrong directions and that was being corrected. Adrienne and I talk on Tuesdays mostly, not always for 20 minutes, sometimes for 5, sometimes for an hour, depending on what there is to say. The conversations are sometimes still awkward in the specific way of two people learning a new language they share no prior fluency in. They are also sometimes easy in the specific way of two people who share the same parents and the same childhood and the same complicated inheritance of love and failure and all the things that families are underneath the stories they tell about themselves. We have not discussed Marcus, not directly, not yet. I think we will eventually when we have enough common ground beneath us to hold the weight of it. She is working with a business consultant, now building a revised version of her brand concept that is considerably more modest in scope and considerably more financially realistic. Whether it succeeds is not something I know or can control. What I observe is that she approaches the work differently than she did before, with less performance and more attention, which is, I think, the only real change that matters. I observe it from a comfortable distance, close enough to see, far enough to let her do it on her own. The restitution process is on schedule. My grandfather's trust will be largely restored within the year. The Hamptons estate, which had been a central fact of my parents' self-conception for 3 decades, has been sold and is becoming, under its new owners, a boutique hotel. My parents have not seen it since they moved out. My mother says she prefers it that way. My father says he agrees and sounds like he mostly means it. Gerald Marsh is cooperating with the regulatory process. His attorney has been in contact with Alina's team. Whatever I feel about Gerald Marsh and what I feel is complicated in the specific way that betrayals by trusted people always are, because they require you to update your understanding of someone you thought you knew, I have placed it in the category of things that are the justice system's to manage, now not mine. I made that choice deliberately. There is a version of this story in which I pursued Gerald with the full force of everything I had available to me, publicly, aggressively, maximally. I did not, partly because the regulatory process was already the appropriate mechanism, partly because maximum aggression tends to produce diminishing returns at a certain level of complexity, and partly because I had made a decision somewhere around year 6 of building the firm about what I wanted the centre of my life to be. I did not want the centre of my life to be other people's failures. I wanted it to be what I was building. The morning after the dinner at Aurelian, I had woken at 5:30, as I always do, and made coffee and sat at my kitchen window, watching the city lighten. I was not in that moment thinking about the dinner. I was thinking about the Newark environmental report and the Whitmore contract timeline, and whether the expansion thesis Elena and I had been discussing was achievable at the scale we were imagining. And then in a gap between thoughts, I had a moment that I can only describe as a rearrangement. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive with the weight of revelation. It was more like a settling the specific physical sensation of something finding its correct position after being slightly misaligned for a very long time. I had built this firm in part to prove something. To the bathroom floor version of myself, to my parents, to the people in that Greenwich house who had looked at me for 24 years and seen a question mark. I had built it out of anger and discipline and the particular fuel of being underestimated. And it had worked, and the work was real, and I was proud of it. But somewhere between year 6 and year 8, something had changed in the building. The structure had become its own reason. The work had become interesting for its own sake, not as an argument, not as a demonstration, but as a thing that was worth doing, because it was worth doing. The distressed properties that came alive again under careful management. The financial structures that resolved complexity into clarity. The 59 assets that each had their own particular story of how they had arrived at their current state and how they might be brought toward a different one. I was still building to prove something in the way that people who have been formed by early wounds always carry some trace of that original fire. But it was no longer the main thing. The main thing was the building itself. That morning at 5:30, with the city lightning and the coffee hot in my hands, I understood this completely for the first time. And I understood that this was the real ending of the story that had started on a bathroom floor in October 8 years ago. Not the dinner, not the documents on the table, not Gerald Marsh walking out of the room, or my father's hands shaking for the first time in my memory, or my sister on the floor of the restaurant bar telling me she was sorry. The ending was this: a morning at a kitchen window, watching the city come alive with a mind that was thinking about the work, because the work was interesting, and a heart that was not. For the first time in 8 years organized around a wound. The wound was still there. It had not disappeared, and I do not think wounds of that depth disappear entirely. They become part of the terrain. But I was no longer living in it. I was living above it or beside it, or in a different geography from it entirely. I was living in the present, in the 59 properties and the Tuesday calls, and the dinner in New Haven every 3 weeks, and the Sunday phone calls, and Nana Ruth's question and the honest answer I had given her. Building toward it, that's the right answer. I picked up my coffee. I thought about the day ahead. I began to plan. This is not a story about revenge. I know it looks like one from certain angles. The dinner, the documents, Gerald Marsh walking out, my sister on the floor, my father's shaking hands, the particular dramatic efficiency with which 8 years of underestimation was reversed in the space of a single evening. But revenge requires that the other person's failure be the point. And it wasn't. It was a consequence, a side effect of a longer project. The project was always the building. The project was always becoming, through whatever means were available, the most complete version of myself. Everything else, the dinner, the documents, the reckoning, was what happened when you build something real and eventually bring it into a room with people who told you it was impossible. The lesson, if there is one, is not that suffering produces success, though sometimes it does. The lesson is not that patience is rewarded, though sometimes it is. The lesson is not even that the people who hurt you will eventually see the truth, though sometimes in the best circumstances they try. The lesson is simpler and harder and less satisfying as a story, but more true as a life. You are not waiting to be seen. You are busy becoming. And if you do that, if you commit to the work, to the honest, difficult project of building a life that is genuinely yours, the seeing tends to follow in one form or another on its own schedule. The bathroom floor is not the end. It is not even close to the end. It is, if you are lucky and if you choose it, the beginning.